Hey everybody, it's Tuesday, it's 3 o'clock, and that means it's Tech Tuesday. Today I'm going to be talking about C-band spectrum. What is that? Well, I'll be right back and I'll tell you all about it. Hey, thanks for joining me. I'm Rick Uzzi. Again, this is Tech Tuesday, and I'm going to be talking about C-band spectrum today. And C-band spectrum is more mid-band spectrum. Last week I talked about CBRS, which is Citizen Broadband Radio Service, and that's being looked at. In fact, it's out now, being used in general kind of non-licensed territory, and they're going to be doing licensing for that here soon. And that is something that's being used for LTE service as well as for 5G. And C-band is more mid-band spectrum that's going to be used for 5G. And let's dive right into that. So C-band spectrum is spectrum used right now by satellites. You've heard maybe of KU band also. So C-band is large microwave, so to speak. Can you have large microwaves? I don't know. But the spectrum is large enough where you need these big dishes, right, to capture this. Whereas your KU band, like if you've got DirecTV or Dish TV, you've got a satellite dish on your house. It's a small little dish compared to these big, what they call big ugly dishes that you might see. So C-band spectrum is mid-band spectrum, and again, mid-band spectrum, as I mentioned last week with CBRS. By the way, if you look below the video, the very first comment, we pinned a comment there with a link to the CBRS broadcast, because that might be of interest to you if C-band is of interest also. So like CBRS or other mid-band spectrum, it's a really good spectrum for 5G. As I've mentioned in previous broadcasts when I was talking about 5G, you've got a couple of different players out there now. Some are using low-band spectrum. That would be T-Mobile doing what they call nationwide 5G, but it's really like LTE. Then you've got Verizon using millimeter wave, which is very, very fast spectrum, but it doesn't travel very far, won't go through walls, that kind of thing. So the C-band spectrum, CBRS, other mid-band spectrum is very good. It's a nice compromise between signals that will go far and not be impeded by trees and walls and those kinds of things, as well as speed. So it's going to be quite a bit faster than 4G and the 5G that's using low-band spectrum, but it can get through walls, so it'll be good for 5G service. So let's talk a little bit about it. So what is it exactly? So it's 500 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz range, so 3700 to 4200 megahertz. And right now, the FCC is working with the people that it has granted rights to the spectrum on trying to get them to release a portion of that. That would be the lower 300 megahertz of that 500 megahertz. So they're trying to get that cleared for 5G service. And they're going to use 280 megahertz of that, and they're going to have 20 megahertz as a guard band between these current incumbents that are using that for their satellite service, and then the mobile operators and fixed wireless or whoever will be using this for 5G service. And again, satellite is the primary use. It's used by satellite companies, programmers and satellite companies to beam programming content up to satellites and then back down again to Earth stations, and then that's distributed out through various means. The portion that's being used is for the downlink, not the uplink. That they want to use for this. And what does that look like? So this is a nice little diagram that NCTA did. So this is applicable to cable, but really it represents what's happening here. So you've got your programmers that have content, and they beam that again through an uplink to satellites that are owned and managed by one of several different satellite companies, who then beam that down to various locations, such as a cable head end. Here, this example, you've got a cable head end, and again, you've got your big dish farms. So they're beaming this programming back down to these dish farms, and then that's distributed out to you and me through our TV programming, or however we are accepting that. And in this case, they're showing it's HFC, or hybrid fiber coax cable plant. It could be fiber. This could be, instead of a cable head end, this could be a local TV station or a radio station, so it could be beamed over the air to antennas as well. It could be, I guess this could be something like a Hulu or Disney Plus that's getting content and then distributing that over the top, basically through that means. So you're getting it over your internet connection, not necessarily through a broadband, through like a cable pay TV connection. So that's what's going on there. And again, they're going to free up 300 megahertz of this, auction off 280 megahertz, and then you've got that 20 megahertz guard band, and that's all on that downlink spectrum from that satellite operator. So you've got 4 incumbents right now here in the U.S. that are doing this. You've got SES, Intelsat, Telesat, and Eutelsat. They're not real creative on their names, but these are the companies, other than SES, I guess. These are the companies that are providing this service right now. And when all of this started coming about, they decided to form an alliance called the C-band Alliance. And they did this so that they would have some leverage. They figured they can group together and have some leverage and negotiate the best terms on how this spectrum is going to be cleared. They don't own the spectrum. These airwaves are basically owned by the public here in the United States, and then the FCC manages that. But as part of managing that, they do grant access rights to various companies. For example, last week, again, talking about CBRS, there were some WISPs that were using that, and then some of that's being used by the Navy, so that's obviously government. In this case, these satellite companies were granted this access. But it's underutilized. This band, it's not being used as efficiently as it could, which is why the FCC wants to take 300 megahertz of this and use it for 5G. So these companies that are using it now, they want to be able to, again, they want to be able to leverage the power that they have in having this, even though it doesn't belong to them. Now, one of the things that they wanted to do, which they've really been lobbying hard for this whole time, is that they would be the ones that would do a private sale or private auction of this spectrum. So they would be the ones that would go find the buyers, they would auction it off, and then they would pay the Treasury a portion. So they would keep some of that for their cost to be able to move into this upper portion of the band, and then they would pay the Treasury as part of that auction. Well, that didn't go over well with the FCC or anybody in Congress because, again, they don't own this spectrum. This is public airwaves. So the FCC just recently, just in the last week or two, announced that they are going to do a private auction, a public auction. So this will be a public auction where the FCC will auction it off, just as they have many times before where they auction off spectrum. They will auction it off. And then out of the proceeds from that, these satellite operators will be paid an amount to cover their costs for vacating the spectrum. And there are costs involved in that. They're going to have to, I believe, consolidate some satellites, maybe share some use there. They're going to have to set up filters and do some other things that are going to be costly for them. So there are amounts there that they'll be paid. Now, what's interesting is this alliance is falling apart. These are the 4 companies that started the alliance, and then Eutelsat decided they didn't want to be in it. They're small. I think they had like 5% or less of the business. And really, SES and Intelsat have like 90% of the business. So even Telesat is small. All 4 of these, another reason that there was some pushback on these guys doing a private sale, but also getting some incentives to clear this early, which I'll mention here in a minute, is that they're all foreign companies. So these are not American companies. SES and Intelsat are based in Luxembourg. Telesat's based in, I think, Ottawa, Canada, and then Eutelsat, it's probably how it's pronounced, Eutelsat, they're in Paris, France. So these are not American companies. So the alliance started to fall apart, and then once the FCC announced that it was definitely going to be a public auction, and these companies were not going to be involved in actually selling the spectrum, then it's almost, now there's like this internal war. I think Intelsat sent a letter to the FCC saying they think they deserve more of a split from the proceeds, and then SES said, how dare you, and they're wanting more, and they're claiming that Intelsat is unilaterally disbanding their C-band alliance. So there's a lot of infighting right now, just in the last couple of weeks on the C-band alliance. So that's pretty interesting to watch. So as far as the auction and payments, the goal is to have the auction, and I think there is even a bill in Congress, I don't know if it's been passed yet, there's a bill in Congress to make sure that this auction happens before the end of the year, so by December of this year. And this is obviously a big focus for the Trump administration and for the federal government to be able to get 5G and get a lead in that. And this band is very important because mid-band spectrum, as I mentioned last week when I was talking about CBRS, that's the first crack at mid-band spectrum that we will have with 5G. C-band is another chunk of mid-band spectrum that we can use, but there's other countries that are already using some mid-band spectrum or that are clearing it out right now. So we want to make sure that we keep the lead in 5G, and there's a real push to get this done as quickly as possible, which is going to be difficult. So again, an auction by December of this year, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be using it by December of this year. The FCC estimates that the cost for these satellite providers are going to be somewhere around $3.3 billion to $5.2 billion to clear this band and to basically move everything that they're doing in the full 500 up to the upper 200 of this band. So there's costs associated with that. And that will be paid out of the auction. So it's not like taxpayers are going to directly pay these satellite operators for this. It'll be auctioned off, and then the amount paid by the companies that are buying this spectrum, that part of that will go to these companies that are clearing the band, and then the rest will go to the Treasury. In addition to these payments just to cover the cost, the FCC has authorized $9.7 billion to kind of give them an incentive to clear this as early as possible, because if we didn't do that, then they could take their time. Again, they don't own the spectrum, but it wouldn't really be fair to pull the rug out from under these companies that have spent so much money. I mean, we're talking about satellite companies here, spent so much money to be using this band to then say, hey, you can't use it. So the FCC is trying to be fair and to give them time and also give them an incentive to get off more quickly if they can. So again, that's $9.7 billion, and they've got to clear, in order to get that, they've got to clear the 120 megahertz at the bottom of that in 46 of the nation's top 50 partial economic areas, or PEAs. I'll explain that in a minute. And that's got to be by September 2021. So that would mean that the very soonest we would see this, assuming, well, I suppose they could do it faster than that, but let's say, I guess the latest, if they decide to take advantage of this incentive, and I would imagine they would be we'd start to see 5G in September of 2021 in this particular band. Obviously, we'll still have 5G in CBRS by that time. We've got it in the low band and the high band spectrum, millimeter wave, but this really sweet spot mid-band spectrum on the C-band side, probably September 2021, and that would be in these limited areas. And then they have to clear all 300 megahertz in the contiguous United States by September 2023. So that's when we'd have this rolled out all over the place. So what are these PEAs? These are, again, these partial economic areas are areas that the FCC identified when they first did a incentive auction for 600 megahertz, I think it was. So they set up these areas that are economic areas based on population. So clearing the top 46 would be the top 46 population areas. The top 3, for example, are New York, followed by Los Angeles, and then Chicago. So it seems almost counterintuitive to me, because it seems like there's plenty of broadband, and there's good 4G service, and there's plenty of wired broadband in your urban areas. And in more rural areas, we don't have a lot of good broadband. So you would think they'd be trying to clear this in the more rural areas first. But I guess maybe they're looking at it as economic, especially for those operators that want to buy the spectrum. It's going to be a much better return on investment for them if they can go forward in these large urban areas and get a lot more customers than it would be if they were to try to market it in these rural areas. So I'm sure that's why they're focusing on these upper economic areas. So as far as who's going to bid on this, it's most likely going to be your usual folks, like your usual large mobile operators, Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. Although really AT&T and T-Mobile are not in much of a hurry, because they both are they're looking pretty good on mid-band spectrum. At T-Mobile, when they acquire Sprint, they're going to have a good amount of it. So it's a competitive advantage for them if it takes a little bit longer, and Verizon is kind of left out in the cold. Verizon is kind of pushing for it because I don't think they have a lot of mid-band spectrum. So I wouldn't be surprised if they are actually going to be one of the operators that bid on the CBRS spectrum when that happens. That's going to be June 25th, I believe. The FCC is going to do the CBRS auction. So that band of CBRS, or citizen broadband, will be used first for 5G for these priority access licenses, which will be licensed CBRS spectrum. CBRS is actually already in use today, I believe, in the general authorized access, which would be your unlicensed spectrum. So that's C-band. It's very interesting just watching this all take place. There's been a lot of news, so I wanted to cover this. There's been a lot of news in the last couple of weeks because of what the FCC has been doing, and now with this C-band alliance kind of breaking up, so to speak, or they're not real happy with each other. So it'll be interesting to see if that holds together. So again, what you should be looking for in this area, not a lot happening here until late this year, December or so, when there's an auction for the spectrum. Then you'll have people like AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile auctioning or bidding for that spectrum, as well as probably some other operators. There might be some fixed wireless operators and others that are going to be trying to bid for this so that they can do 5G mobile and 5G fixed wireless kinds of applications. So, all right, well, hopefully this was helpful for you. If you would like to subscribe to our channel, just click the little subscribe button and then ring the bell, and you'll be notified whenever we are live. So give us a thumbs up if this has been helpful for you. Next week, I'm going to be here with Peter Olivia, and actually I think Pete and I are planning on being here for 3 weeks in a row. We're going to be talking about downstream spectrum capture. So it's a feature in cable modems and some set-top boxes, digital set-top boxes, where you can view the spectrum that's passing through that box remotely on a laptop, on a phone, and it's coming straight from the cable modem. You don't need to go out and drive out to a customer's house and hook up a meter. I mean, you can actually do it right from your office. You can view live spectrum, and we're going to be looking at that a few weeks in a row, looking at a couple of different applications that are available to be able to do that, to view live spectrum, to be able to get, actually to even be able to get notifications or monitoring when there's something wrong with the downstream spectrum, and actually tell you in advance before maybe even the customer calls. So again, that'll be next week on Tech Tuesday at 3 o'clock, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.